Hello, my name is Brian Stansberry, and I'm a principal software engineer at the JBoss division at Red Hat. And I'm here today to talk to you about the new multi-server management capabilities in the AS7 release, in particular the new stuff that we've added in the Alpha 1 release, which is just out. So I'm here to do a little demonstration of multi-server AS7 management. Okay, what I want to do is basically a simulation of a situation where you had two different physical or virtual machines, each running AS7 instances. And in this case, I'm going to have each one is going to run 3 AS instances, so a total of 6 servers. And in AS6 and earlier releases, every AS server is basically an independent, self-managed thing. So if you need to manage them, you either have to coordinate it with themselves, or you use a tool like JBoss Application Network, which will administer multiple servers, but it's not really unified, and it's not shipped out of the box as part of the AS, the multi-server management. AS7, we're adding multi-server management where there's a central administration point, and basically that administration process called the domain controller is responsible for all administration of all servers. So in this situation here, I'm pretending to have two physical machines running AS instances, but they're all running on my laptop for the sake of this demo. So basically this directory here, host 1, pretend that's one host, and host 2 is another host. And each one has the AS700 Alpha 1 distribution unzipped onto its file system. So 1 and 2. And I mentioned there's a central process that acts as the administration point, the controller, for all the servers in the domain. There's one of those per domain, and that, in this case, is going to be on host 1. And one way you can tell that is because it has this domain XML file in its file system. And the domain XML file has all the central configuration information that ends up being applied across all the servers in the domain. So the domain controller is responsible for managing that, and so that's why the file exists there. To show you briefly some of the things in the domain XML file, let me scroll up to the top. So domain XML, there's a bunch of stuff in here I'm going to skip past and just talk about a couple key concepts. One is profiles. So a profile is basically a named set of service configurations. So a service or subsystem configuration is a better term. So subsystems are basically subsystems within the AS. So each subsystem is generally responsible for one major set of functionality. And in this case, for example, we have an OSGI subsystem which allows you to deploy OSGI bundles into the AS. So a profile is a named set of subsystem configurations. And a profile can be applied to servers. So servers can be running, each server runs a particular profile. So here we have a profile for a server that would only do OSGI bundles, okay, and named it OSGI. Another profile, messaging profile, which can be applied to a messaging server that handles JMS or Hornet Q, the JBoss messaging project. Web profile just has a web server and nothing else. And in here we have a profile that we call the default profile. And one thing profiles can do is they can include other profiles. So that allows you to basically mix and match things. You can have small profiles that are very self-contained, and then when you want a server that has a larger set of capabilities, you just include other profiles. So that allows you to have small profiles, simple profiles that are applied to some servers, and maybe some other servers you can apply a more complex profile. Okay, so that's briefly profiles. I'm not going to get into all the details of what's in the profile. Another thing I want to talk about is server groups. So every AS7 instance in the domain belongs to a server group. Different server groups can have different configurations, meaning they can be running different profiles. So you could have one server group that had just the web profile, for example. So therefore it was just acting as a web tier. And then you could have a messaging tier running the messaging profile. So every server belongs to a server group. All all members of the server group run the same configuration, the same profile, so they're consistent. They're managed as a unit. The domain controller takes care of keeping them consistent. But you can have multiple server groups, so across your domain, not all servers have to be the same, because you can have multiple different server groups. In this case, we're configuring two server groups: a main server group and an other server group. Here, for simplicity's sake, we're actually having them run the same profile, the default profile, which is actually something people do in real life. You can have multiple server groups running the same profile, and that just allows you to administer different sets of servers separately. For example, you could bring down one server group, do an upgrade, and then bring it back up. That would be a common thing we would see people doing with AS7 domains. While you do that, your other server group is still running, so you're not taking an outage. Other configuration that's important is a host XML file. There'll be one of these on every physical or virtual host that's running AS instances, and that includes basically machine-specific configuration information. So let's take a look at that quickly. Key thing it has in it is the list of servers that are actually running on that machine. So here we've got 3 servers going to be running on host 1. Main 1, main 2, another 1, and it includes what group they're part of. Okay, so these first 2 are part of the main server group, and the third one is part of the other server group. Another thing I wanted to briefly talk about is the domain controller element, which basically specifies how the process that manages the servers on this host interacts with the domain controller. And in this case, we've got this local element, which basically means that this actual process is the domain controller. Okay, so it doesn't have to figure out how to remotely contact it. It is the domain controller. If we go over to host 2 here at its host XML file, you can see here that it's got 3 servers as well. And one thing that's different here is the domain controller element. Instead of having a local element, instead it has this remote element that includes information on how to talk to the remote domain controller.